asked men about lots of their experiences of violence growing up, and the blue bar shows here violence from a parent. Quite high rates in some of the countries. You see quite normative, in fact, in Croatia, Rwanda, and India, but not low as well in Chile and Brazil in terms of experiencing some form of corporal punishment or physical violence growing up from a parent. The green is the percentage of men who reported experiencing violence from a teacher in the school setting growing up. I didn't have time to put the third bar, which is boys who experienced being a victim or fights or bullying at school, which also came out between 40 and 60% for all the boys. There's not many, I think we ran very quickly the number to see what percentage of boys or men didn't report any experience of physical violence growing up, and it's a sliver of men who don't experience some physical violence either at home, in school, or in the community as they grow up. That factor, witnessing or experiencing violence growing up, was of course the most significantly associated factor with men's use of violence. Witnessing violence in the home of origin or experiencing violence in the home or community was the factor that across all the countries was the most highly associated with men's use of violence. Here's some of the data on men's use of sexual violence. On the whole, much lower than their use of physical violence, but not insignificant. The blue is sexual violence against a partner in the last year. You'll see that runs from less than 1% to 14% in the case of India. Sexual violence against a partner ever is the beige bar. That goes from 1% to 20%. And then sexual violence overall runs from about less than 1% to India, that had these quite high rates of sexual violence against an intimate partner. We didn't ask that question of women in the survey, so I don't have a comparison, but some of the WHO data that we have shows rates that are quite similar to that. Just some other indicators of men's use of other forms of violence. This is looking at men's participation in robbery, their participation in fights, firearm ownership, the percentage who had been arrested, the percentage who had ever been imprisoned. And these are quite high rates. If we look, Croatia, for example, 36% of men reported they had ever been involved in any kind of a robbery, from a minor theft to more armed robbery. Not insignificant as well in Brazil, Rwanda. Fights, quite a common experience for many men. Firearm ownership, particularly in the Latin American countries, quite high. Arrests, this one quite caught our attention here. A quarter or more of men had been arrested in many countries. Typically, these were young men. Well, these were men with lower levels of education at the lower income levels who had ever had this kind of encounter. Often they had had no other encounter with the public sector except for having been arrested. As we looked at some of the other data about their use of public health services or other access to public services, sometimes their only encounter with the public sector was as a result of being arrested. And then the rates of imprisonment here. The Rwanda number was quite high. We wonder if some of that may have to do with the temporary imprisonment of large numbers of Hutus after the genocide. Some of those as a result of the Gacaca court system, etc., of an attempt to hold the genocidaires accountable for the genocide. So just to give you a sense of the other violences that men carry out and the other kinds of violences that men are also subject to. Firearm ownership was one of the few of these that was also associated with men's use of violence against women. That is, there was an association there. Men who reported firearm ownership were also more likely to report having used violence against women. We also asked men about paying for sex. The blue bar shows the percentage that say they've ever had sex with a sex worker. Brazil, it's quite a common phenomenon. India was 27%, Chile not far off with 22%. We also asked about those, of those who had ever paid for sex with a sex worker, what percentage of those suspected that the sex worker was under the age of 18? Typically men don't know, they don't ask. We hear in qualitative research men say things like, well, if she was offering it to me, who am I to ask whether she was 18 or not? But you'll see a fairly sizable percentage believed that perhaps that at least one of those sex workers was under the age of 18. In India, 48% thought that. We also asked them, of those who had paid for sex with a sex worker, did they think the sex worker was coerced into sex work? And a significant number, particularly in the case of India, and not a small number in the case of Brazil as well, thought that they had had sex with a sex worker who they think was trafficked or somehow coerced to be involved in sex work. So this tells us that men are not completely oblivious to that, and that we're talking about a problem that's not simply a handful of men. If we multiply that 8% times the 56, and that 56 is of the whole sample, we're talking something 5%, if we can extrapolate from the 2 cities in Brazil to Brazil nationwide, we're saying 5 or 6% of men think they've had sex at least once with a sex worker who was coerced into sex work. In India, if you do the math, the numbers are even higher than that. So it's a not insignificant number of men, at least in a few settings, who understand perhaps that there's coercion going on, that the sex worker was under the age of 18, and that this is a population-wide phenomenon, not simply a handful of men. So some overall reflections on the factors that come out. One, of course, we know the importance of what happens during childhood. And how do we think about creating spaces for men to make sense of, to question, to construct different meanings of the violence that they have too often faced while they're growing up. Gender norms, as I mentioned before, a key issue in there. How much you believe and understand in a version of manhood that sees women and men as equal, that doesn't see power as associated with using violence, that doesn't see power as associated with being what it means to be men, that those norms and those underlying norms are certainly part of the equation as well. As we dig into what factors are associated with those norms, we do see that younger men in a few settings show more flexible views about what it means to be men. So we are seeing what looks to be a bit of a gender shift. Although in a couple of countries, we actually saw a bit of a U-curve that older men showed more flexible views. And one of our hypotheses there is that men do get experience, and that getting experience in living together in partnership relationships, that some men do, contrary to popular opinion, some men do come to learn from those processes. So we saw those trends were a little conflicting depending on the country. Men with higher levels of education, particularly completed secondary education, had more flexible or more equitable gender norms. Other factors, well, economic stress, of course, I mentioned before, one of the key factors. Other associated factors were alcohol use. That was a prevalent factor in about 5 of the 6 countries. Firearm ownership, I mentioned before. In Rwanda, we asked about experiences during the genocide, and those men who reported either experiencing violence during the genocide or witnessing violence during the genocide had a significantly higher rate of reporting having used violence against a female partner post-genocide. So these are the factors that we see coming out. We've not yet, for those of you who enjoy higher order statistics, we've not yet done the multiple regression stuff. We can share those with you later on as soon as we've published those. Excuse me for this slide with lots of writing on it, but just the key point that I wanted to point out here is, while we've been asking what are the factors that lead to men's use of violence, some of my research, a lot of it from a qualitative point of view, and informed a lot by program work, has been trying to say, how do we understand the men who have all those risk factors, so to speak, but yet don't end up, or many of those risk factors, and don't end up using violence, either against other men or against a female intimate partner. And in some of the research that we've carried out in the US and Brazil, finding a number of factors of what factors seem to come out as we listen to the life stories of some young men in settings like this, to get a sense of what keeps them from repeating much of the violence that they see around them. And these are some of the issues that came out. Men who tell us that there was someone important to them, a mother, almost always women, but not always, often a mother as a caregiver or a woman as a caregiver, who they think that they would be significantly disappointing, or that there would be they would lose that valued relationship if they used or got involved in violence. Young men who could find different forms of identity, not those that were based on, I'm tough, I can beat up other guys, I can put my girlfriend in her place, and therefore I'm defined as a man, but could find other things that they thought gave them a sense of identity, other sets of skills, other ways of being men that they found resonated in the community, resonated in their family, that also seemed to be there. Men who could step back a bit and say, I saw my father do this, I saw my stepfather do that, but I don't want to repeat it because I saw the harm that it caused me. Men who could give words to feeling fear and pain as a result of violence. In a sense, men with a bit higher level of emotional intelligence to be able to express or give words to that sense of fear or pain that they experienced, and to say it out loud, or at least to reflect about it individually or with others. The peer group mattered a lot. Guys who could find a peer group, and that connects with the identity here. Young men who could find peer groups who said, you don't have to have all the sex with all the partners you can find. You don't have to beat up every guy who threatens you. You don't have to beat up your girlfriend to define yourself as a man. Guys who could find peer groups who said that's not what it means to be men typically could sustain that identity and that behavior for a longer amount of time. And then community processes, communities that create social sanctions against young men or adult men who use violence. And at the community level feeling like, oops, if I do that, I know that I'll get held accountable for it in some way. So the impunity issue we know does matter. These are some of the factors that, that we found in qualitative research seem to make a difference. In our work in Brazil, one of the things that we did was, when we identified these young men, doing some household data, and then doing some focus groups and identifying some non-violent or more equitable men, one of the first things that we did is invite many of them to become peer promoters, or ask them if they would help us design programs. These are in communities where young men are too often seen as associated with drug trafficking groups. I'm sure many of you have seen images or know stories about or have visited favelas in Rio, where too often the discourse about what it means to be men are associated with these drug trafficking gangs, even for young men who don't get involved. And what we tried to do is identify young men who say, I don't want to be part of that version of manhood. I'd like to be part of helping promote other ways of being men. I'm going to skip that one there. Many of us have been taking this kind of research to say, so how can we translate this to the program level? One of the examples I gave is, well, identifying the voices of resistance out there. That even if we're talking about settings where 1/3 to 40% of men over the lifetime have used violence against a female partner, there are lots of men who are not using violence, and yet lots of men who are questioning that. So there are norms in the community that already support some nonviolence. What we're trying to do is figure out ways that we turn up the volume. And most of us have been using kind of a spectrum of change model where we look from the individual level. How can we promote this individual leadership development of those voices that already exist to question the violence at the community level? Try to take it into the level of community education, designing curricula and approaches to have a cohort of those men in a growing number get out there. Then how do we take it to the level of key stakeholders so that it's not just a handful of men doing this, but those who run public institutions who can be engaged? Then how do we take it to the level of strengthening organizational practices, then to the level of coalitions and networks, and then up to the level of policy? Most of our work is stuck about right here. Some of it gets to here. This is the stuff that we're trying to do kind of next. If I were to sort of judge the field overall and look at this as a spectrum, we're kind of often about right here. Much of the work has started at the community level, key NGOs doing this work, but now we're kind of at that threshold of how do we take it further up the line.